My name is Allan Ingram. I was born in 1943 at a midwifery house in Bobcaygeon. The lady's name was Mrs. Johnson. Her place was on Jane Street. I believe a couple of my younger siblings ended up being born in the hospital. We lived in Bobcaygeon for a short period of time, and then my dad and mother purchased rural residence on Highway 49 north of Bobcaygeon. So I grew up in the country. My dad had a small beef operation or cattle operation on the acreage, but we were right next door to my grandfather and grandmother Ingram, so I spent a lot of my time at their farm, which was right next door. I attended a one-room school just about a mile from our residence on Road 49. We walked back and forth to school. I remember one of the highlights when I got older, I got a bicycle, so we didn't have to walk, but I remember coming to Lindsay to buy the bicycle. And I think it was Adam's store, which turned later years was the Tangney location. But the interesting thing that I remember about the bicycle, I bought it on time and had to pay so much a month. My dad wouldn't pay for it all, the whole thing, so he said, "You're going to have to pay for part of this." So I remember buying that bicycle on time. Anyway, at the one-room school, I think most, at the time that I was there was the grades 1 to 8, and I think a total school population probably at any one time was 15. One of the things that was interesting looking back, the students had to walk next door to get water to drink and bring water to the school in a pail, because the well at the school had sulfur smell to it, and none of us kids would drink that water. So we walked next door to get from the nearest farm a pail of water and brought it back to the school. The other interesting thing was we all drank out of one dipper that hung on a nail by the pail of water. It's quite a difference in standards to today's health requirements. As far as the entertainment or the, I say, out of class activities at the school, we had a softball diamond, but it was rather limited because there was flower beds around, of course, we had to cope with, and a small yard to start with. And in the wintertime, I remember there was a pond just over the hill on the neighbor's farm, and we were allowed to go and skate there during the lunch hour. And I know there was once or twice when we got in trouble because we ignored the bell at 1 o'clock and decided to go back when we were ready. And of course the school lady didn't appreciate that deviation. In Bobcaygeon, there was a high school and an elementary school. The elementary school was down on King Street. It was a 2-story structure. And the high school was up in the Rokeby, which is the north part of Bobcaygeon, and it was actually on the road leading to Fenelon Falls. And there was a high school there, Hillcroft High School. It had been built initially for the Boyd family. When they came over here, they wanted to have a spot for their families or children to attend. And I believe they ended up bringing their own instructor over from England to run that school. But Hillcroft High School closed in about 1950 or approximately there, and so then everybody from that point on went to Fenelon Falls Secondary School. And then a new elementary school was built on Balaclava Street, I believe around the 1950 as well. These teacher had to keep the fire going all day. So we as students, we would have to make sure that we had enough wood carried in from the woodshed into the school so to keep the fire going, but it was the teacher's responsibility to keep it going. And that was the other thing to remember about the one-room schools, of course, there was 8 different grades in there, and that one teacher was having to provide a lesson for each of the 8 grades. I know in our situation there would maybe be 1 kid in each grade, or maybe 2, but it still required extra work from for the teacher. I always enjoyed my time working or helping, I guess, at the grandfather's farm next door, and spent a lot of time there. But I remember the first night that they had electricity at that farm. I just happened to be visiting them at the time, and I remember us all standing out in the yard, and when the switch was pulled to provide electricity throughout, it was amazing to see the various lights coming on in the building, the farm buildings and the home, for the very first time. Up until then, of course, we were using kerosene and Aladdin lamps and carrying a lantern out to the barn to do the chores. So that was a highlight that I remember. They were one of the first people on that road to receive hydro. The other thing, before I forget, my grandparents were also one of the first people to have a television. So for quite often, especially on Saturday night, I would go down and visit them, and then to see their hockey games and the wrestling on television, and then walk home about 11 o'clock. Our home wasn't very far, but it was a bit of a challenge for a young guy at 11 o'clock at night to be walking home in the dark. So that was part of an interesting point in life. When I finished my public school at the SS number 1 Harvey was the name of the rural school that I attended. Following completion there, I went to Fenelon Falls High School, and we had one of the people that lived in our area had a taxi service for school kids, and that's how we got into. We came from the north of Bobcaygeon into Bobcaygeon to meet the bus to go to Fenelon Falls. So I attended Fenelon Falls High School, and we were traveled by way of bus over there. And of course, the other one of the interesting points about bus travel, there was about 10 to 12 miles and 15 to 20 minutes, I guess, on the bus. And there was usually some activity on the bus that wasn't supposed to be there. And one of the penalties, if you happened to act up during the busing, you were kicked off the bus. And in those days, the driver didn't have to take you home or take you to school. You would be dumped off wherever the incident occurred. So I know, I don't recall getting dumped off in the middle of a run, but I know other people were. But I remember once at the high school, I was one of the guys that thought it'd be fun to throw one of our fellow students' books out the window, and they went to the lower floor. And of course the principal got word of that, and he met with us and said, "Now, you fellows are from Bobcaygeon. As soon as the bus leaves for Bobcaygeon, then you're free to go." So our penalty for that misdemeanor was we hitchhiked them to Bobcaygeon. When I was 12 years old, around 12 or 13, I forget, my dad and mother purchased a butcher shop in Bobcaygeon on the main street and operated it for several years. And when I was available, I helped in the store, and I bought a balloon-tired bicycle which had a big carrier on the front of it. And so I was able to deliver groceries. In those days, groceries were delivered usually to the house for a lot of people. And I always remember the train used to come into Bobcaygeon. It followed the lake, basically Sturgeon Lake on the south shore of Sturgeon Lake, into Bobcaygeon. And it stopped right on the street near the Anglican church, and of course right beside the Kawartha feed mill. The feed mill, in those days, farmers used to bring their oats and grain to the feed mill to get ground and made into chop and to get other materials added to it. So that was a very busy operation at that time. There was a cattle area, fenced-in area there near the rail station as well, where the people would bring cattle that were going to be shipped out by train. And of course, the lumber was another product that was, logs were shipped out on the train and lumber was brought in. And the other product was gasoline. They had a buried pipeline that they were able to bring the gasoline in and then pump it over to some of the stations in the center of town by way of underground pipe for transport. But in the summer of those days, the tourists came and stayed in lodges. Some big lodges operated because the tourists usually came and stayed for a week or two, and they needed accommodation. And the big lodges, like the one was on Sherwood Street, was called the White House. It was a major building on one side where the people stayed when they were sleeping or in leisure activities, but they crossed the street to the dining room. So that was always interesting to see the influx of American tourists into Bobcaygeon. And of course, one reason that they came to Bobcaygeon was for the fishing. Bobcaygeon used to be sort of the prime area for fishing, especially pickerel, in this part of Ontario. And at that time, not many people had their own boat and motor, so there was fishing guides. And Bobcaygeon had about a dozen fishing guides. They had their own boat, a bigger boat, and they would contract with the tourists then to take them out on the lakes and fish all day and catch some fish, hopefully. And at that time, they usually, part of the day's outing would be a fish dinner on Big Island. Most of the fishing guides had a camping spot with a table and fireplace on the island. And so they would stop there and cook the dinner, hopefully the fish that they had caught for their tourist guests. And they had a little building down on just on Riverside Drive. It was sort of their hub where they all went in the morning to find out who was interested in hiring them for the day, and the tourists would make the arrangement there. To go back to was interesting, the farmers in those days, they were, the idea was to ship milk or ship cream to make some money. And I remember when each of the farms had like a cement cistern that they filled with cold water. And so when we're done milking each night, they would put the milk in cans and put them in the cistern to keep cool, because they didn't have refrigerated service to accommodate the milk supply. And then, of course, the dairy or the creamery would come the next day or two and pick up the milk or cream and take it into town. And of course, in those days, milk and bread were delivered door to door. And ice as well was the other product that was delivered door to door. And usually in town, of course, it was delivered with a horse and wagon. Out in the country, it was delivered with a truck. And one of the winter activities, of course, was the manufacturing of ice, blocks of ice, and they were cut out of the lake. The Kimball family had a nice business operation. They would go out in the winter and cut a supply of blocks of ice and then take it to their shed, where it was stored until it was needed next summer. And they had sawdust that they threw on top of the various layers of ice to help preserve it until it was needed in the summer months. At that time, when the people wanted milk, they would set their empty bottles on the doorstep or out on the porch, and the milkman would come along and he would know that by the number of bottles what number they wanted, or if there's a different type. The way that they were paid for in most instances was you bought your tickets ahead of time. So you bought some tickets for cream or skim milk ticket or a homo milk ticket, and you put the ticket in the bottle, so when the driver come along, he knew what to leave, and it was already paid for, so he wasn't required to pick up the money. In terms of entertainment in those days, it was interesting. We had a theater that operated, a movie theater that operated in Bobcaygeon when I was, I guess, 12 to 16 years of age. We had a theater. There was a dance hall, which was in operation on Front Street on the water, but a big dance hall that every Saturday night for sure there would be music and dancing in the dance hall. There was a lawn bowling greens that were operated right by the canal behind our post office in those days. So in the summertime, lawn bowling was a popular activity. There was a ball diamond. We had a ball diamond was in the fairgrounds. In those days, the fields of the fairgrounds were just empty most of the time, but now they've been taken up with campers. But in those days, the field was available, and there were no parks for balls, so we had a ball diamond. Everybody went to the fairgrounds to play ball. Saturday nights were the big event for the rural families. Most times we wouldn't be in town during the week, but Saturday night was special. And people that had hens and for eggs, they would take their egg collection from the week and take it into town on the weekend to the egg grading station. There was an egg grading station operated by the Kennedy family, and I remember the practice would be to go over town on the main street, park the car. The kids would get out and go and run up and down the streets with other families who were in town for the Saturday night. And there was a pool hall, I remember, where billiards were played. The men would congregate in the pool hall and share stories and play some pool, and the ladies would be waiting in the car with the kids and wondering when the husbands were going to get out of the pool hall and go home. That was certainly a ritual that carried on for a lot of years, but as time progressed, of course, people were into town more frequently, and cars were more popular or more available for people to get back and forth. Another service that we had in the rural area that is long gone, I think, was we used to have a Watkins, a distributor for the Watkins products, and another one for the Raleigh's products, and those were for salves and ointments and special medicines. And of course, some people had a favor of the Raleigh's and some people favored the Watkins products, but those were delivered door to door. Another activity that, of course, we as kids were involved in the summer was swimming. The rural kids, of course, we had to come into town to learn how to swim. And with Bobcaygeon situated on the lake, on the Sturgeon Pigeon Lake, there was no shortage of places to swim. But I remember one of the things that was pretty popular with as we kids grew older, maybe in their early teens, would be to dive into the canal between the locks. Later on, that was decided it was risky and shouldn't be allowed, so the swimming area was in a confined area in a more peaceful water. One of the things that always was a feature in Bobcaygeon, and one of the few locations where there's a swing bridge, and the swing bridge has to be open to let the bigger boats through, and of course there's lots of boats going through the Bobcaygeon locks. But in the early days, those locks and the bridge were all operated manually. Now, of course, they're hydraulically operated, but when I was young, we used to watch at least there'd be two guys that would be required to turn the handles to open the locks and shut them. So they were busy all day in the summer, particularly to let boats through from time to time and stop the traffic while they swung the bridge. Eventually, the bypass was constructed to provide a second route over the over the river as it does today. But in the early days, there was a lot of frustration with the lock system and the swing bridge in Bobcaygeon. Some of the services we had back in when I was a teenager anyway, there was 2 blacksmith shops in Bobcaygeon, both operated by people by the name of Henderson. And I remember going with my dad to one of them, and I think most times it involved horseshoes, getting new shoes or getting more shoes for the horses. And so going to the blacksmith was a regular feature. Because most of the people didn't have refrigerated capacity to retain beef for a long period of time, the community set up what was called a beef ring, and several of the farmers would agree to become part of that beef ring with the idea that they would take turns in terms of slaughtering an animal, so that they would each share in the slaughtered beef or beast and would get a chunk of it, and so none of them had to keep a lot of beef on hand for an extended time. And then there was a community locker business established, and refrigerated lockers, so that at this central building in Bobcaygeon, people would bring their beef or pork or whatever and place it in the locker. You'd pay a rent for a small locker in the refrigerated building. The other thing that was sort of related, there used to be a slaughterhouse. One of the butchers used to operate a slaughterhouse where people could bring their animals to be slaughtered and processed at a location, and I presume there was a fee. I'm not familiar with that, but I presume there was a fee to have that service performed. Some of the names, family names that were dominant when I was growing up were Reeds, where they had a big grocery store on the main street. They also had a lumber sawmill operation and a lumbering operation. Grants was a name of builders. When you think of houses being built in Bobcaygeon or building, Grants was one of the names that would be familiar for that requirement, and Staples was another one of the building contractors. The masons, any masonry work, the names that came to mind were Parkers and Kosh's. They were the dominant names in terms of providing that service. And Finley's, another name, they were big in contracting and building of any type. So those were some names that, and when I look at the list now, a lot of those names are no longer dominant or even available or even exist in the Bobcaygeon area. But when I was growing up, those were certainly names everybody was familiar with. I remember on the main street there was one house where the central phone system was established. It was owned by the Henderson family. So all the rural, we lived north of town, and we were on a line, a separate telephone line, and everybody on that line would have a different number, and not in the sense of ring numbers. So I remember our ring was 3-1, so that meant there was 3 little short rings and 1 long ring. So if we heard that ring on the line, of course, mother would go and answer the phone. And of course, we also knew when other people's rings, if somebody maybe had a ring of 2-2, well, we knew that was Grandpa's number being called. So in those days, there was people being accused of listening in when they weren't supposed to be listening in. But those phones, if we wanted to phone somebody in Bobcaygeon, or not Bobcaygeon, but probably Bobcaygeon or any other area, it had to go through the central system. So you phoned the central system, and an operator there, I know they were all ladies, they answered the phone and said, "Who did you want to talk to?" And you say, "Well, I want to talk to Mrs. Jones." So they would connect your phone with Mrs. Jones's phone in Lindsay or Fenelon, and you would be chatting over the system. But that was a central phone system that existed for many years, and usually there was one or two operators sitting there 24 hours a day on shifts providing that service. We had one bank in Bobcaygeon up until the last probably 25 or 30 years. Bank of Montreal was the only bank available in Bobcaygeon, and then subsequently CIBC set up a business. Another interesting thing was the number of gas stations when you look back to compare it to today. There was a gas station operated by Kennedy's, Belbeck's, Thurston's, Pogue's, Devitt's, Anderson's, Walker's, and now I believe we have probably 2 gas outlets in Bobcaygeon by comparison to those earlier days when there was 8 of them. The local ambulance service, this was like a private service compared to today, which is publicly funded, but back in earlier days the ambulance service was provided by a family by the name of Nisbet, and rather interesting that they also operated the funeral home. The lumber mills too, of course, were a big feature in those early days. People brought their logs into the lumber yards, one operated by German Lumber, which is still operating, get their logs sawed and sell the lumber to the lumber dealer. Reed Brothers was the other name that were big in our area, and they had the same service. Bring your logs in for sawing, and they would buy the lumber. Of course, in the wintertime, one of the things that we enjoyed was going to the arena to skate. And the arena when I was a teenager was one building which was on King Street, a wooden structure. It had natural ice, and a part of the same building was 2 sheets of curling ice. So the building actually served both functions. And in the off hours, whenever the arena wasn't open, it was quite common to clean off part of Little Bob River and skate on the ice and play hockey there on Little Bob River. It was pretty well guaranteed there'd be a hockey game going there every day of the week when the weather or the ice was suitable. And of course, we had not necessarily official nets, but you just had a pair of rubbers that you set up to serve as the goalposts. But skating on Little Bob River was quite common. The main street runs right down to the river, so people had no problem getting down to the river to enjoy the skating. Bobcaygeon, I guess, always had their local police service. I don't remember them all, but I remember when I was young, the constable's name was Ralph Woods. Then when he stepped aside, there was a new man came into town, and his last name was James. His name was Loris James, but Edwin, the community gave him the name of Jesse James. And the interesting thing about Jesse, he had a pink Cadillac to use for, not sort of traditional police cruiser, but had to buy his own car, and it was a pink Cadillac. So he had an interesting reputation for carrying out the police duties with this pink Cadillac. And we thought it was quite a step forward when he and his assistant got walkie-talkie radios, so that one could sit on one side of town and forward messages to the other guy at the other side of town. So that presented a little bigger challenge for the local lads at that time. We had, of course, every municipality had a library. We had a library. Amy Kosh, she was the librarian there, it seemed, for 50 years. Probably wasn't 50, but she was a librarian, well respected, and everybody enjoyed going in and to the library and having a chance to chat with Amy. When we were growing up, we lived north of town, as I mentioned, and every Sunday, Mother and Dad would be going to church we ended up, at that time, the Sunday school was at 10 o'clock and church was at 11 o'clock at Knox Presbyterian Church in Bobcaygeon. So some Sundays we would be brought into Sunday school, and Dad and Mother may decide, well, we're not going to church today, so we would be picked up at 11 and taken home. Most Sundays, of course, we went to Sunday school at 10. Dad had to go home and then come back with Mother at 11, and then we all stayed for church. And our family, my mother's family, the Andersons, they were a large part of the Knox congregation. And so we ended up going to the Knox Presbyterian Church. I think the Ingram family mostly went to the United Church, but because of Mother's association with the Presbyterian Church, we went there. When I finished high school at Fenelon Falls, I came to Lindsay. I wasn't sure what career to consider, but a couple of that I had thought about was a veterinarian because of my familiarity with the farming operation, and another one was an airplane pilot. But it was interesting when the veterinary idea. We had a vet in Bobcaygeon, McKinnon, Dr. A.F. McKinnon. He seemed to be there for 100 years. I'm sure he had a very long service line, but he was quite a senior gentleman when I was in high school. And he offered to pay for my fees to go to vet college if I took that route. Unfortunately, when I was in grade 13, chemistry was a problem for me, and I decided not to bother completing the chemistry course, and so veterinary college was out the window. I was always strong in mathematics, and I found out that at that time you could take a correspondence course to become a chartered accountant. The courses were delivered through Queen's University, but you didn't have to attend. You were able to submit written record or lessons weekly and achieve the degree that process, which I did. So when I was 17, I started working in Lindsay with the chartered accountant firm at that time known as Ward, Watson and Rathwell. And the Queen's University program was a 5-year program, which I completed and graduated, got my degree in 1966. I stayed in working for the public accountants for 3 years, and then there was an opportunity for a new position with the Board of Education. It was a Victoria County District High School Board at that time, and they were just being established, whereas previously each area had their own board, but this was a county board being set up, and it was going to take care of elementary and secondary. So I applied for the position of the senior business official with the Board of Education in '69. And was successful in getting that position. So I worked with the Board of Education, which later became the Trillium Lakelands District School Board. For 30 years, I retired in 1998, at the end of 98, after working for 30 years. So I was part of the amalgamation of a lot of the rural one-room schools. In fact, there was a lot of concern, of course, by the public when rural schools were closed, but it was interesting. After the new schools were open, the parents would usually come and say, boy, I wish we'd have moved ahead on that front sooner. But it was an interesting time, but some challenging times in terms of getting rid of a tradition that had existed for a lot of years and most people were comfortable with. And of course, related to that was the increase in the need for busing of students who were formerly they were usually able to attend their local school by walking. So once I retired, in '97, I guess, the province decided to amalgamate the Victoria County School Board with the Haliburton County and the District of Muskoka. So there was 3 boards that were amalgamated into one. And of course, in each of these organizations, there was a senior business official. So me and 2 other chaps were in those positions. I was the most senior in terms of age, and decided at that time that I stayed for 1 year after amalgamation to get things in place, and then retired after the 1 year. After retiring, I joined the Bobcaygeon Curling Club to curl, and I also served there on the executive for 6 years, moving through the ranks, president and vice, or past president, and so on. The other organizations that I've been involved with are the Bobcaygeon Fair. For a lot of years, I was the person that looked after the ticket sales for the fair, and helped with the Bobcaygeon Fiddle Contest for 40-some years. It's still an annual feature in Bobcaygeon, and I was on that committee for a lot of those years. Following up on the curling club, I decided to pursue involvement at the Settlers Village. Up until that time, I often drove by the place, but I don't think I'd ever visited. But I went and asked if I could take part in helping up there in serving on the board. I have been there for, I think this is about 12 years now, serving on the board and helping with various events. So I did another little community service for a number of years. I was the auditor of the Burlham Cemetery Company as well, and various other local committees. Certainly when our 2 sons were young, I was involved with all of their sporting activities, ball and hockey and so on. So got to work with a lot of the youth in the community. And when the new park was set up in the north end of Bobcaygeon, which is now known as the Tommy Anderson Park, one of the things that, of course, I was at that time younger and playing ball there regularly. We had a fundraising event to pay for some lights, because of course the new park had no lights. And one of the big money raisers that was successful, we had Bobby Orr come there and play a game of ball with some of our local guys, and we raised quite a bit of money as a result of Bobby being present for an activity. The other thing that when the park was established, I helped to set up the tennis club organization there. I was one of the people that thought it'd be good to have tennis for the community. So we did establish 2 tennis courts in the park. So it's important, I think, that we all contribute what we can in terms of our abilities and skills and experience to make our communities a better place to live. And I think that's important for everybody to keep in mind.